The castle that called her name. So, imagine you're standing in your own living room on a totally normal Tuesday. You're drinking your morning coffee, the sun is shining through the blinds, and everything is completely fine. But then, you hear someone whispering your name. Not just your name, but a specific, quiet whisper that seems to vibrate right at the base of your skull. Now, imagine that whisper isn't coming from a person in the room. It's coming from a 600-year-old ruined stone castle located thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. A place you have never been to and never even heard of. That is exactly what began happening to a 8-year-old woman named Sarah. And honestly, the scariest part of this story isn't that this ancient, decaying fortress was calling out to her. The truly terrifying part is what happened when she finally decided to answer it. Sarah lived what you would call a painfully normal life. She was a freelance graphic designer renting a small second-floor apartment in a sprawling cookie-cutter complex just outside of Portland, Oregon. Her world was measured in inches and pixels, tight deadlines, and iced lattes from the drive-thru down the street. She was the kind of person who kept her desk meticulously organized, complained about the constant Pacific Northwest rain, but secretly loved it, and spent her Friday nights safely on the couch watching true crime documentaries. She was incredibly grounded in reality. If a floorboard creaked in her apartment, it was just the wind or the building settling. She didn't believe in ghosts, she didn't believe in the paranormal, and she definitely didn't believe in curses. Her life was predictable, safe, and entirely her own. But looking back at the police reports and the scattered journals she left behind, it's clear that her mundane routine was just a fragile shield. And right around late October, that shield began to fracture. It started with a physical sensation. You know that strange magnetic pull you get when you stand near the edge of a steep drop? That sudden, almost irrational urge to just lean forward? Sarah started feeling that exact same vertigo, but she'd be sitting safely at her desk, staring at her computer monitor. Then the sleep disturbances began. Every single night, exactly at 3:15 a.m., her eyes would snap open. There was no loud noise in the apartment, no bad dream fading away. Just a sudden, freezing cold sweat and the distinct, heavy auditory hallucination of massive wooden doors slamming shut, echoing over and over in the back of her mind. At first, she chalked it up to stress. She figured she was just drinking too much caffeine and working too late. It made sense, right? A totally logical explanation. But then, the doodling started. Sarah would be on a boring hour-long Zoom call with a client, mindlessly scratching a ballpoint pen onto a yellow sticky note. When the call ended and she looked down, she hadn't drawn random geometric shapes or squiggles. She had drawn a very specific, jagged stone tower with a collapsed, asymmetrical roof. She frowned, crumpled it up, and threw it away. But the next day, she drew it again and again. Soon, there were hundreds of these jagged little towers scattered across her desk, all drawn with an obsessive, heavy-handed pressure that nearly tore through the paper. She had absolutely no idea what this building was, but it was becoming very, very clear. The building knew her. As the weeks dragged into November, the doodles evolved into something much darker and much more consuming. Sarah wasn't just absent-mindedly sketching on sticky notes anymore. She was buying massive 8x2 4-inch sketch pads from a local art supply store. She would spend hours after work ignoring her actual freelance deadlines, just aggressively shading these jagged stones with charcoal. Her hands would be completely stained black by the end of the night. And that bizarre magnetic pulling sensation, it was escalating. It was no longer just a vague feeling of vertigo at her desk. She would be sitting in a booth at a Denny's off Interstate 5, eating a completely normal Tuesday night dinner, and suddenly, the entire room would feel like it was tilting at a 4-5-degree angle. She would literally have to grip the edges of the Formica table, her knuckles turning white, just to keep herself from sliding out of the booth. And the sounds? The auditory hallucinations were bleeding into her waking hours. Even with her heavy-duty noise-canceling headphones on, she started hearing the distinct guttural croaking of ravens and the howling of a bitter freezing wind. And honestly, if you put yourself in Sarah's shoes, You would do exactly what she did. You would try to logic your way out of it. She was a grounded, modern woman living in the US suburbs. She wasn't about to call an exorcist or believe she was cursed. Her first thought was environmental. She drove straight to Home Depot, bought a top-of-the-line carbon monoxide detector, and plugged it into the wall of her Portland apartment. It read, "A perfect, safe 0." When that didn't work, she turned to the most logical explanation left. She was a graphic designer. She spent 40 to 50 hours a week scrolling through thousands of reference images, stock photos, and architectural vectors on sites like Getty Images and Pinterest. She reasoned with herself, I must have just scrolled past a photo of this creepy, ruined tower while looking for assets for a client, and my stressed-out subconscious just locked onto it. As for the 3:15 a.m. wake-ups, she blamed the aging pipes in her cookie-cutter apartment complex. It was just the water heater kicking on. It made total sense. It was a perfectly neat, rational explanation, and for about 3 days, Sarah actually felt a wave of relief. She convinced herself she was fine, the mystery was solved, but the truth was about to violently collapse around her. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Sarah decided to put the final nail in the coffin of her anxiety. She took one of her most detailed charcoal sketches, scanned it into her computer, and ran it through a reverse image search online. She figured she would find the exact stock photo her brain had memorized, laugh about it, and finally get a good night's sleep. She scrolled through pages and pages of Google results. Medieval ruins, Scottish keeps, old Irish fortresses, nothing matched. But then, on the 4th page of results, she clicked a dead link that redirected her to an obscure, archived paranormal message board from the early 2000s. Right there, in the middle of the screen, was a blurry, low-resolution photograph taken by a backpacker. Sarah stopped breathing. The temperature in her apartment seemed to instantly drop by 10 degrees. It was the tower. Her tower. The exact same jagged, asymmetrical roofline. The exact same crumbling stone foundation. It wasn't a stock photo, and it wasn't a fantasy illustration. It was a very real, very physical place, a forgotten 14th century ruin located over 5,000 miles away, buried deep in a dense, isolated forest in Eastern Europe. But that wasn't what caused Sarah to push her rolling chair back from her desk in absolute horror. It was the caption beneath the photograph. The backpacker who took the picture had written a small paragraph complaining about the strange architecture. Specifically, they pointed out a bizarre, incredibly unique detail, an iron-wrought gargoyle mounted directly above the eastern archway, which was entirely missing the left half of its face. Sarah slowly, shakily turned her head to look at her desk. Sitting right next to her keyboard was the sketch she had obsessively drawn the night before, and right there, perfectly positioned above the eastern archway, drawn with heavy, dark strokes of charcoal, was an iron-wrought gargoyle, missing the exact left half of its face. There was absolutely no way she could have known that detail. Her logical shield didn't just fracture in that moment. It completely shattered. The castle wasn't just a memory, it was real, and it was calling her. At that point, it made sense to just walk away, to close the laptop, burn the drawings, and pretend she never saw that old message board. And honestly, for a normal person, that is exactly what would have happened. But you have to understand the psychological toll this had taken on Sarah. She hadn't slept a full night in weeks. She was running on stale diner, coffee, and pure, unfiltered adrenaline. The realization that this castle was a real, physical place didn't just scare her, it activated a deep, primal obsession. It felt like a magnetic pull in the center of her chest. She needed to know times why times this 14th century ruin in the remote Carpathian Mountains of Romania was broadcasting into her brain. So she did something entirely out of character. She drained her savings account, cashed in all her PTO, and booked a red-eye flight to Bucharest. 3 days later, Sarah found herself behind the wheel of a rented Dacia Duster, driving down a heavily rutted logging road about 50 miles outside of a small Transylvanian village. The American suburban sprawl she was used to had been replaced by suffocating, dense pine forests. The air outside was freezing, hovering around 40 degrees, and a thick, soupy fog clung to the trees. After driving as far as the muddy road would allow, she parked. According to the GPS coordinates she had painstakingly extracted from that old forum post, the ruins were exactly 1.2 miles deep into the woods. She zipped up her jacket, grabbed her heavy-duty flashlight, and started walking. The forest was unnaturally quiet. There were no birds croaking, no wind rustling the branches, just the wet, heavy sound of her boots sinking into the mud. But as she crested a small ridge, the silence was broken by a sound that made her stomach drop. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, a heavy, physical vibration in the air. The exact same sound she had been hearing in her apartment right before the dreams would start. And then she saw it. Looming out of the fog, rising maybe 60 feet into the gray sky, was the jagged, asymmetrical roofline of the tower. It was identical to her charcoal sketches, down to the very last crumbling stone. And right above the eastern archway, covered in centuries of green moss, was the iron-wrought gargoyle, missing the exact left half of its face. Sarah couldn't breathe. Her logical mind was screaming at her to turn around and run back to the car. But that magnetic pull was stronger than ever. It was as if the building was physically dragging her inside. She stepped through the archway. The temperature immediately plummeted. It was easily below freezing inside the stone walls, and the air smelled like wet earth and old copper. She didn't need a map. Her feet moved on autopilot, navigating the dark, decaying corridors as if she had lived there her entire life. She found the narrow, spiral stone staircase and began to climb. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the highest room of the tower, the exact room from her dreams. The room she had felt was the source of the calling. She shined her flashlight around the circular stone walls. The room was empty. Just centuries of dust, broken masonry, and dead leaves that had blown in through the collapsed roof. For a second, Sarah felt a bizarre wave of disappointment. There was no ghost, no ancient artifact, just an abandoned, ruined room. She let out a long, shaky breath, convincing herself that maybe, just maybe, coming here had broken the psychological loop. But then, her flashlight beams swept across the center of the room. Sitting perfectly square on top of a flat stone pedestal was a piece of paper. It wasn't old parchment. It was a crisp, modern piece of heavy stock sketching paper. The exact same brand Sarah bought at the art supply store back in Seattle. Sarah's hands started to violently shake. She took a step forward, then another. The thrumming sound in her ears was deafening now. She reached the pedestal and shined her light directly onto the paper. It was a charcoal drawing. But it wasn't a drawing of the castle. It was a hyper-realistic, incredibly detailed sketch of Sarah's own bedroom back in her apartment. Every detail was perfect. The messy pile of clothes on the chair, the specific brand of alarm clock on her nightstand, the way her blankets were tangled, and right in the center of the drawing was Sarah herself fast asleep in her bed. But what caused Sarah to drop her flashlight and let out a blood-curdling scream was the perspective of the drawing. The angle of the sketch wasn't from the doorway. It wasn't from the window. The drawing had been sketched from the perspective of the ceiling, looking directly down at her. As if something had been hovering right above her bed, watching her sleep night after night. She hadn't been dreaming of the castle. The thing in the castle had been dreaming of times her. Sarah didn't remember the run back to the car. She didn't remember the panic drive to the airport or the agonizing 14-hour flight back to the US. The emotional aftermath was a blur of pure, unadulterated trauma. Within 48 hours of landing, she broke the lease on her apartment, left most of her furniture behind, and moved into a brightly lit, modern high-rise condo on the other side of the country. She threw away every piece of charcoal she owned. She stopped drawing completely. She needed to sever the connection. And for about 6 months, it worked. The dream stopped, the thrumming sound disappeared, she finally started to heal. Which brings us to the final aftershock. The detail that ensures Sarah will never, ever sleep with the lights off again. It was a Tuesday morning. Sarah woke up feeling completely rested. The sun was shining through her high-rise windows. She stretched, threw off her blankets, and walked into her pristine, white-tiled bathroom to wash her face. She turned on the faucet, let the warm water run, and looked down at her hands. Her fingertips were completely stained black. Confused, she rubbed her fingers together. It was soot. No, not soot. It was thick, heavy charcoal dust. Her blood ran cold. She slowly backed out of the bathroom and walked into her living room. And there, sitting perfectly centered on her glass coffee table, was a brand new, freshly drawn charcoal sketch. It was a drawing of her new condo's front door. And the door was wide open, static and silence. How a TV show solved a murder. Imagine sitting on your couch on a random Tuesday night. You're flipping through channels, nursing a lukewarm beer, and you land on a true crime show. One of those dramatic, late-night network specials. You're half watching, letting the narrator's deep voice wash over you as they detail a horrific, unsolved murder from 3 years ago. But then, a photograph flashes on the screen, a piece of evidence. And honestly, your heart just stops. Your stomach drops through the floor. Because you don't just recognize the blurry figure in the background of that crime scene photo, you know exactly where that person is right now. It sounds like a Hollywood script, a 1 in a million coincidence. But for the family of 3-4-year-old David Miller, a primetime television broadcast wasn't just entertainment, it was the only thing that finally dragged a phantom killer out of the shadows. To understand how a TV show cracked a case that baffled detectives for years, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the cameras, before the national broadcast, and before the nightmare, we have to go back to the 14th of October, 2017. David lived in a sprawling, quiet subdivision just outside of Columbus, Ohio. It's the kind of American suburb where the houses are separated by exactly 40 feet of manicured lawn, where the hum of lawnmowers fills the weekend air, and where nothing truly bad is ever supposed to happen. David was, by all accounts, just a regular guy. He wasn't perfect. He had a habit of leaving his junk mail piled up on the kitchen counter for weeks. He drank way too much stale diner coffee, and he was still trying to figure out what to do with his life after a messy divorce. But he was deeply loved. He had a golden retriever named Buster and a steady job at a local auto parts distributor about a 12-mile drive down Interstate 71. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The air was crisp, that classic Midwestern autumn chill. David woke up at 6 a.m. We know this because his phone logged him checking his email. He threw on a faded gray hoodie, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door. He didn't lock the deadbolt. He just pulled the door shut behind him. It's a tiny, mundane detail, but it tells you everything you need to know about his mindset that day. He wasn't scared. He wasn't looking over his shoulder. He thought he'd be home by 6 p.m., but he never came back. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come with a dramatic scream or a shattered window. It came with silence. At 6:30 p.m., David's younger brother Mark sent him a text message. "Hey, still on for the game tonight?" No reply. By 8 p.m., Mark called. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Now, at that point, it made sense to just brush it off. People get busy, phones die. Maybe David had stopped at a bar after work, or maybe he was just asleep on the couch. You always try to find a logical reason, right? You never jump straight to murder. But the next morning, Buster was found wandering the neighborhood, his leash dragging behind him on the concrete. The front door was still unlocked, the junk mail was still on the counter. And then, at 2:15 p.m. that afternoon, an Ohio State Highway Patrol officer noticed a 2012 Ford Fusion parked haphazardly on the gravel shoulder of a desolate county road about 9 miles off David's usual route home. The officer ran the plates. It was David's car. When the officer approached the vehicle, his hand instinctively rested on his holster. The driver's side window was rolled down about 3 inches. Inside, the keys were still in the ignition. A half-empty cup of cold coffee sat in the cup holder. But it was what was in the back seat that made the officer immediately reach for his radio to call for backup. Lying there, right in the middle of the upholstery, was David's wallet. Fully intact. Cash, credit cards, driver's license, all untouched. It wasn't a robbery. David hadn't just walked away. Something had intercepted him on his way home. And whoever or whatever it was hadn't left a single fingerprint behind. The discovery of the car changed everything. The local PD, who had initially treated this as a standard missing adult case, suddenly shifted gears. You don't leave your wallet sitting in the back seat of an unlocked car with the windows down unless you were forced out in a hurry. For 3 agonizing days, volunteer search parties combed the dense Ohio woods bordering the county road. Helicopters chopped through the crisp autumn air. And then, on Friday afternoon, a local deer hunter walking a ridge about 2 miles from where the Ford Fusion was abandoned noticed something strange near a concrete drainage culvert. It was David. When investigators arrived at the scene, the atmosphere was heavy. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves mixed with the sharp, metallic reality of a crime scene. David was found face down. The coroner would later determine he had been shot once in the chest with a small-caliber weapon. But here is the detail that kept seasoned detectives awake at night. His shoes were missing. Just his shoes. And his white athletic socks? They were completely clean. He hadn't walked through the mud to that culvert. He had been placed there. And honestly, at that point, the police did exactly what you would expect them to do. They looked at the inner circle. Remember that messy divorce we mentioned earlier? Her name was Elaine. The split had been finalized just 6 months prior, and it was anything but amicable. There were bitter disputes over the house, the retirement accounts, and even custody of Buster. If you've ever listened to a true crime podcast, you know exactly where the detectives' minds went. Statistically, it's almost always the spouse. To make matters worse for Elaine, she had recently started dating a guy named Marcus, a hot-headed local contractor who drove a lifted dark blue Chevy Silverado. And wouldn't you know it, a local farmer had called the tip line to report seeing a dark pickup truck idling aggressively near that exact stretch of gravel road on Tuesday evening. Suddenly, the puzzle pieces were snapping together perfectly. Marcus intercepts David on his way home from the auto parts distributor. Words are exchanged, things get physical, and it escalates into a fatal confrontation. The missing shoes? A panicked attempt to stage a robbery. It was a neat, logical narrative. It made sense to the detectives. It made sense to David's grieving brother. But here is the problem with neat, logical narratives in real life. They rarely hold up under a microscope. Detectives brought Elaine and Marcus into the precinct, fully expecting the pressure of an interrogation room to crack them. They placed photos of David's abandoned car on the metal table. They waited for the slip-up. Instead, Marcus calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a receipt from a roadside diner in Columbus, time-stamped 5:45 p.m. on that Tuesday. Detectives immediately pulled the diner's security footage. And there it was. Clear video of Marcus and Elaine sitting in a vinyl booth eating meatloaf over 60 miles away from the crime scene during the exact window of time David was abducted. Their alibi was ironclad. The dark pickup truck seen by the farmer? It turned out to belong to a 16-year-old kid who was out checking fence lines for his dad. In an instant, the entire theory collapsed. The police were back to square one, staring at a whiteboard full of dead ends. Who intercepts a man on a random county road, leaves a wad of cash in the back seat, takes his shoes, and vanishes into thin air without leaving a single fingerprint? The investigation stalled. Weeks turned into months, and months bled into 2 agonizing years of silence. David's file was shoved into a drawer, becoming just another cold case in the Midwest. That is, until a producer for a syndicated true crime television show decided to run a brief 15-minute segment on the anniversary of David's death. And when that episode aired, it didn't just generate a tip, it woke up a monster. When the syndicated episode of Unsolved Frontlines aired to over 3 million viewers that Friday night, the local precinct braced for the usual flood of crackpot theories and psychic visions. But what they got was something entirely different. 3 days after the broadcast, a brown cardboard package arrived not at the police station, but at the show's production office in Los Angeles. The intern who opened it expected fan mail. Instead, she was hit with the smell of stale leather and damp earth. Inside the box was a pair of scuffed, size 10 New Balance sneakers, David's missing shoes. And nestled inside the left shoe was a handwritten note on cheap, yellow legal paper. The writer wasn't confessing out of guilt, he was annoyed. The TV host had theorized that the killer panicked, leaving the wad of cash in the back seat out of sheer terror. The note read, "I didn't panic. I left the money because I'm not a thief. I'm a hunter." You got the narrative wrong. Honestly, when you study criminal psychology, you learn that ego is the ultimate undoing of a psychopath. This man couldn't stand the idea of a television show making him look like a sloppy, panicked amateur. He needed them to know it was a perfect crime. But his desperate need for credit was his downfall. The FBI immediately pulled the postmark from the brown paper wrapping. It was mailed from a USPS drop box just 4 miles from the county line where David's car was found. Investigators pulled the surveillance footage from a nearby gas station that had the drop box in frame. At 2:14 a.m. on Sunday, a figure walks up to the box and drops the package inside. When detectives enhanced the grainy footage, the breath left their lungs. It wasn't a shadowy drifter. It was a face they saw every single day. It was Gary, the county's overnight 911 dispatcher. The same Gary who had taken the frantic missing persons call from David's brother 2 years ago, the same Gary who cheerfully poured stale Folgers coffee from the break room carafe while detectives agonized over the whiteboard. He had literally been sitting 20 feet away as they built their entire timeline. Gary knew the county's dead zones. He knew exactly which stretches of gravel road had no cell service and no residential security cameras. He had intercepted David that Tuesday evening, flashing a spare badge he bought online, pulling him over under the guise of a routine traffic stop. He took the shoes not to stage a robbery, but as a trophy, a sick souvenir he kept in his basement while he listened to the police radio, completely insulated from suspicion. The emotional fallout of this revelation was catastrophic. Elaine had spent 2 agonizing years being the town pariah, whispered about in supermarket aisles, enduring the heavy suspicion that she had orchestrated her husband's murder. All the while, the real killer was the guy dispatching the patrol cars to her neighborhood. When the police raided Gary's split-level ranch home, he didn't fight. He was sitting at his kitchen counter, eating a bowl of cold oatmeal. He just looked up, wiped his mouth with a paper towel, and calmly asked if he could grab his jacket. But the horror doesn't end with his arrest, which brings us to the final, most disturbing piece of this puzzle. During the search of Gary's meticulously clean basement, investigators found a heavy steel lockbox hidden behind the water heater. Inside, they didn't just find the fake badge. They found a ledger, a composition notebook filled with dates, license plate numbers, and physical descriptions. David's name was on page 42. There were 68 pages in total. And the very last entry, written just hours before the police kicked his door in, detailed the daily routine of a 16-year-old kid who drove a dark pickup truck. The same kid who had been out checking fence lines for his dad, the one who accidentally ruined Gary's original plan to frame Elaine's boyfriend, Gary wasn't just watching the investigation unfold, he was picking out his next target from the witness list. The Oak Creek Illusion. Imagine you're sitting in a suburban garage on a freezing Wisconsin night, playing poker with 3 guys you've known for years. The neon beer sign is buzzing, someone's cracking open another Miller Lite, somebody's bluffing badly. It's safe, familiar, boring even. And then, completely by accident, you discover a file suggesting that one of your closest friends might be a serial killer. And the truly horrifying part? The file also suggests someone else at the table already knew. Oak Creek, Wisconsin is the kind of place where people obsess over lawn care and snowblower brands. Quiet cul-de-sacs, 2-car garages, backyard grills. Nothing about it feels dangerous. Which is exactly why what happened on the 12th of November 2018 still unnerves the detectives who worked the case. The official police report starts with a 911 call that lasted 14 seconds. The caller whispered, "I don't know who I'm sitting with," and disconnected. When officers arrived at the split-level home, they found 4 men inside the attached garage. 3 were sitting silently around a poker table. The 4th man was dead, collapsed face first onto the green felt. No weapon, no sign of forced entry. And according to the 3 surviving men, the garage lights flickered out for maybe 2 seconds. When they came back on, their friend was dead. Honestly, if you heard that from a suspect interview, you'd assume they were lying. But to understand why the scene made absolutely no sense, you have to understand the people involved. Thursday night poker was a ritual for Dave Miller, Greg Tate, and Mike Chen. They'd been gathering in Dave's insulated garage for years. The garage itself was peak Midwestern suburban masculinity. Folding chairs, a humming space heater, stale cigar smoke trapped in the drywall, and a mini fridge stuffed with cheap beer. Dave was an insurance adjuster. Methodical, quiet, the kind of guy who organized poker chips by denomination and color. Mike worked in IT and was going through a brutal divorce. He mostly kept to himself, nursing beers while staring at his cards. Greg was the loud one, a construction foreman with massive hands, a booming laugh, and the confidence of somebody who always believed the next card would save him. Then there was Arthur. Arthur had moved into the neighborhood only a few months earlier. He was polished, friendly, maybe a little too polished, but he fit in fast, he remembered birthdays, he brought expensive snacks, he laughed at everyone's jokes half a second too quickly. That Thursday night, Arthur showed up carrying a $150 bottle of scotch to a $20 poker game. At the time, it felt generous. Later, detectives would call it a tactical mistake. Around 10:15 p.m., Arthur folded a hand early and stood up to grab another beer from the mini fridge. He left his smartphone face up on the poker table. A text message appeared. Dave glanced down automatically. Just human instinct. The message read, "Are they suspecting anything yet?" Dave later told investigators he felt his stomach drop so suddenly it was almost physical. Then, at the exact same moment, the motion sensor floodlight outside the garage switched on. Through the frosted glass window of the side door, Dave could see a human silhouette standing motionless in the driveway. Not pacing, not knocking, just standing there. Arthur noticed it too. According to Dave, Arthur froze completely, gripping the edge of the mini fridge so hard his knuckles turned white. For one awful second, Dave thought he was witnessing the beginning of a home invasion. Then, Arthur smiled awkwardly and explained everything away. He claimed he was secretly buying a boat, said the text was from the seller, said the man outside was delivering paperwork because he worked late shifts, and honestly, it made perfect sense. That's the terrifying thing about good lies. They don't sound dramatic. They sound boring. Arthur opened the garage door. A man in a dark Carhartt jacket handed him a manila envelope and walked away into the cold Wisconsin darkness. The tension evaporated instantly. Everyone laughed. The poker game continued. But about 45 minutes later, Arthur stepped inside the house to use the bathroom. While he was gone, the manila envelope accidentally fell open. Inside weren't boat documents. They were surveillance photos. Photos of Dave inside his own living room. Photos of Mike leaving work. Photos of Greg's truck with the license plate circled in red marker. And beneath the photographs were heavily redacted files labeled Subject 1, Gregory Tate. Subject 2, Michael Chen. Subject 3, David Miller. At first, Dave thought Arthur was some kind of stalker. Then he saw the status labels. Mike, cleared. Dave, cleared. Greg, primary suspect. The file referenced possible DNA matches connected to multiple dump sites along Interstate 95. That's the moment Dave realized Arthur wasn't spying on them. Arthur was investigating one of them. And according to the documents, the man they suspected was sitting 3 feet away eating pretzels. Imagine trying to finish a poker game after that. Imagine watching somebody laugh, drink beer, shuffle cards, and crack jokes while secretly wondering if they've buried bodies somewhere. Dave later admitted he couldn't even hear the conversations anymore. He just kept staring at Greg's hands. Construction worker hands. Strong enough to build houses, strong enough to kill someone. Arthur returned from the bathroom, acting completely normal. He smiled, sat down, continued playing cards, and Dave said something about that disturbed him more than anything else afterward. Arthur never once checked whether the envelope had been opened, almost like he wanted Dave to see it. The following Tuesday morning, the FBI raided Greg Tate's house. Black SUVs tore through the neighborhood before sunrise. Tactical teams deployed flashbangs and dragged Greg outside in handcuffs while stunned neighbors watched from their lawns in pajamas. The investigation exploded nationally over the next few weeks. According to federal investigators, Greg was linked to multiple disappearances across several states. Construction sites he supervised became excavation zones. Detectives uncovered human remains buried beneath poured concrete foundations and abandoned grading pits. Mike moved out of Wisconsin shortly afterward. Dave stayed. But people close to him said he fundamentally changed. He installed cameras everywhere, motion lights, reinforced locks, security film over the windows. Because once you discover evil can sit across from you at a folding table for years pretending to be your friend, your brain never fully resets. But the detail that truly shattered Dave didn't come from Greg's arrest. It came a month later. An FBI agent visited Dave's house to clarify timelines about Greg's access to the property. During the conversation, Dave casually mentioned that Greg had helped renovate the garage years earlier. Greg had installed the doors, the windows, the deadbolts. The FBI agent went completely silent. Then he slowly closed the file in his lap and asked, "Greg installed your locks?" Dave said yes. The agent took a breath and explained that investigators had found something in Greg's basement workshop during the search warrant execution. A master key ring. 30 different house keys, each tagged with addresses from the neighborhood. One of them belonged to Dave's house. Attached to Dave's key was a small red label, and beside it, investigators found a handwritten schedule detailing Dave's wife's work hours. Think about that for a second. For 3 years, every single night, Dave locked his doors, believing he was protecting his family. But the man who installed those locks already had the keys. Splintered, the Staten Island House of Horrors. You know, when detectives talk about a messy crime scene, they usually mean a struggle, a knocked-over lamp, a rug pushed out of place, maybe some blood spatter on the baseboards. But the 2-story vinyl-sided house on Elmwood Park Drive in Staten Island wasn't just messy, it was excavated. End drywall was ripped out in jagged 3-foot chunks. The stuffing from the living room sofa was piled up like freshly fallen snow. Floorboards, solid oak floorboards, had been pried up with what looked like a heavy iron crowbar. And in the center of it all lay 5'8" Diane Gallagher. N.N. And honestly, the detectives standing in that suffocatingly hot room in mid-July weren't just asking who killed Diane. They were looking at the shredded walls, the smashed ceramic tiles, the absolute frantic destruction of a quiet middle-class home, and asking, what on earth were they looking for? N.N. But before we step inside that house, we need to understand who Diane was. Because the brutality of the scene just doesn't match the reality of her life. And Diane was a fixture in Great Kills, a quiet, working-class neighborhood on Staten Island's South Shore. She was a retired pediatric nurse, 58 years old. She had lived in that same house for almost 30 years. Her husband, Tom, had passed away from cancer 5 years prior. And since then, it was just her and a golden retriever named Buster. N.N. Her life was built on comfortable, mundane routines. She was the kind of neighbor who knew exactly when the street sweeper came by. Every morning at 7 a.m., she'd walk Buster down to the corner, holding a large Dunkin' iced coffee. Her neighbors knew her schedule down to the minute. You'd hear the distant, steady hum of traffic from Highland Boulevard, the occasional roar of a lawnmower, the thud of the morning paper hitting the driveway. She was the neighbor who would grab your Amazon packages and put them behind your planter so they wouldn't get stolen. She was safe. She was deeply, profoundly normal. None, which brings us to Tuesday, August 12th. None. It's about 85 degrees out with that thick, oppressive East Coast humidity that makes the air feel heavy in your lungs. It's 4 p.m. Diane's next-door neighbor, a retired sanitation worker named Mike, is out front wrestling with a tangled garden hose. And he happens to glance over at Diane's driveway. Her silver Honda CR-V is parked there, right where it always is. But something is off. N. And at first, it's just a tiny detail, a minor glitch in the suburban matrix. Diane's trash cans are still sitting at the curb. The garbage truck came through at 10 a.m. Diane, times never times, leaves her cans out past noon. She was meticulous about it. N. And Mike wipes the sweat off his forehead and walks over to pull the cans up her driveway. And that's when he notices the front door. And it's open. Not wide open, just cracked maybe 2 or 3 inches. A stack of mail, junk mail mostly, a couple of Valpak coupons, and a utility bill is wedged in the brass slot, fluttering slightly in the sluggish summer breeze. Mike stops. The neighborhood is suddenly very quiet. The hum of the traffic seems to fade into the background. He calls out her name. Diane? Nothing. At that point, it made sense to just assume she left it open for a breeze, or maybe she was in the backyard. People don't immediately jump to murder. We rationalize. We tell ourselves, it's nothing. N. But as Mike walks up the 3 concrete steps to her porch and pushes that heavy wooden door open, the first thing that hits him isn't a sight. It's a smell. A thick, suffocating wave of raw plaster dust, stale air, and the sharp, undeniable metallic scent of blood. Mike didn't want to step any further inside. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn around, go back to his driveway, and call 911. But he had known Diane for 20 years. So he took a breath, pushed the door open a few more inches, and stepped into the foyer. The first thing he registered was the sound. It was the frantic, muffled scratching of dog paws coming from somewhere deep inside the house. Buster. Then his eyes adjusted to the dim light. What Mike saw didn't make sense. It was as if a localized tornado had touched down exclusively inside Diane's living room. The floral sofa, the one she kept meticulously vacuumed, was gutted. Foam stuffing was scattered across the hardwood floor like dirty snow. But it was the walls that made Mike freeze. The drywall had been ripped open. Huge, jagged sections of sheetrock were torn down to the wooden studs, exposing the pink fiberglass insulation and electrical wiring underneath. And then he looked down the hallway. Diane was lying near the entrance to the kitchen. We won't dwell on the gruesome details of the scene, but suffice it to say, it was immediately clear that she was gone. The violence inflicted upon her was staggering, completely incongruous with the quiet, sun-drenched suburban street outside. Mike stumbled backward, his heavy work boots crunching over chunks of plaster. He barely made it to the porch before he pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands. When the NYPD from the 122nd Precinct arrived, they taped off the perimeter, pushing the growing crowd of whispering neighbors back behind the police cruisers. Detectives stepped into the house, and immediately they formed a working theory. At that point, it made perfect sense. Staten Island, like a lot of American suburbs, was quietly battling a brutal opioid epidemic. Property crimes, specifically aggressive home invasions, had seen a sharp uptick. Junkies breaking in, looking for cash, jewelry, or prescription painkillers. It was a tragic, but common, narrative. The working theory was simple. A burglar breaks into the house, thinking it's empty. They are desperate, maybe high, tearing the place apart in a frantic search for a hidden safe or a stash of valuables. Diane comes home from her morning walk with Buster, catches the intruder in the act, and the burglar panics. It's a burglary gone horribly, tragically wrong. It's a neat explanation. It gives the chaos a shape. It's the kind of story that makes the neighbors lock their doors a little tighter at night, but ultimately lets them sleep, believing it was just a random, unlucky encounter. But honestly, the longer the crime scene investigators stayed in that house, the more that theory began to disintegrate. It started with the small things. The artifacts of the investigation that just didn't line up. If this was a desperate junkie tearing the house apart for quick cash, why was Diane's purse sitting right there on the kitchen island? Inside it, investigators found her wallet, completely untouched, with $400 in crisp $20 bills. They moved to the bedroom. Diane's jewelry box was sitting open on her dresser. Inside, her diamond engagement ring and a heavy gold necklace were sitting right on top. On the desk in the corner, a brand new $2,000 MacBook Pro was resting in plain sight. A panicked burglar doesn't leave behind untraceable cash and high-end electronics. And then there was the destruction itself. When the adrenaline faded and the detectives really looked at the damage, the frantic search theory completely collapsed. The walls weren't just smashed in a blind rage. When you looked closely at the edges of the ruined drywall, you could see straight, deliberate lines. Someone hadn't just taken a hammer to the walls, they had used a utility knife to score the sheetrock before prying it away in neat 3-foot sections. In the master bedroom, the heavy oak floorboards hadn't been randomly splintered. Someone had taken a crowbar and methodically popped them up one by one, exposing the subfloor beneath. This wasn't a frantic, panicked search. This was an excavation. Someone had spent hours in this house, dismantling it piece by piece. Which brings us to the most chilling detail of all. The detail that completely shatters the idea of a panicked intruder. When officers finally located Buster, the golden retriever, he wasn't cowering under a bed or injured. He was locked safely inside the downstairs half bathroom. And sitting right next to him on the tile floor was a freshly filled bowl of water. A desperate burglar doesn't pause a frenzied home invasion to make sure the family dog is hydrated. The realization settled over the detectives like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The killer hadn't been surprised by Diane. They had dealt with Diane first. And then, with the homeowner dead on the floor and the dog safely locked away, they took their time. They weren't looking for cash. They were looking for something hidden inside the very bones of the house. And whatever it was, Diane had died because of it. When crime scene unit technicians finally peeled back the rest of the splintered drywall in the master bedroom, they found it. A rectangular cavity, exactly 14.5 inches wide, sitting flush between two wooden 2x4 studs. There were fresh scrape marks on the surrounding wood. 4 heavy-duty lag bolts lay discarded on the subfloor. Someone hadn't just been looking for something. They had known exactly what was there, a hidden wall safe. Detectives brought Diane's daughter, Emily, into the precinct. They asked her about the safe. Emily looked confused. She explained that her father, a retired Staten Island sanitation worker who passed away 5 years earlier, had installed a safe in the late 90s. He was an old-school guy who didn't entirely trust banks. He used to joke at family barbecues that his real retirement fund was in the walls. But Emily told them something else. Diane had emptied that safe years ago. She had moved the money into a mutual fund shortly after her husband died. So, who still thought the money was there? Who knew the exact layout of the house? And, more importantly, who did Buster the Golden Retriever know well enough to let them lock him in a bathroom without barking his head off and alerting the neighbors? It wasn't a sophisticated forensic dragnet that broke the case, it was a smudge. A single partial thumbprint lifted from the rim of Buster's stainless steel water bowl. When they ran it through the system, it didn't ping a career burglar or a desperate drifter. It pinged a 8-year-old local guy with a minor DUI record. His name was Tommy. He was Diane's nephew. And honestly, that's when the reality of this case shifts from a terrifying home invasion to something so much darker, because it means the killer didn't break in. He was invited. Let's reconstruct that Tuesday morning. Tommy knocks on the door around 9 a.m. Diane smiles, opens it, and lets her nephew in. We know this because investigators found a second coffee mug sitting in the kitchen sink, still containing a splash of French vanilla creamer, Diane's favorite. They sat at the kitchen island, they drank coffee. And at some point, Tommy, who had been quietly spiraling into gambling debt, asked for a loan. When Diane refused, the nephew she had babysat, the kid she bought Christmas presents for, picked up a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove. He didn't hesitate. After Diane fell, Tommy didn't panic. He calmly walked Buster to the half bath. He filled the water bowl, leaving that single thumbprint behind. And then he went out to his truck, grabbed his utility knife and a crowbar, and spent 3 hours methodically tearing his aunt's house apart, looking for a ghost fortune. For the family, Tommy's arrest wasn't a relief. It was a second death. The quiet Staten Island neighborhood where Diane lived, the kind of place where people leave their garage doors open and everyone knows everyone was fundamentally shattered, Emily didn't just lose her mother. She realized she had been sitting across the Thanksgiving table from her mother's murderer. The trial was a quiet, suffocating affair. Tommy sat there, staring blankly at the defense table, barely looking up when the judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But there is one final detail about this case. A detail that stays with the detectives long after the file was boxed up and sent to the archives. When police executed a search warrant on Tommy's apartment, they found the wall safe in his garage. He had used an angle grinder to cut through the heavy steel door. The detectives looked inside, expecting to find something. But they found exactly what Emily had told them they would find. It was completely empty, except for a thin layer of dust and a small faded Polaroid photograph of Diane and her late husband tucked into the back corner. Tommy had murdered his aunt, dismantled her home, and destroyed his entire family for a metal box containing absolutely nothing. The brass key. The mundane mistake that sank a Titan. We all know the story. The unsinkable behemoth. The freezing Atlantic. The band playing on the slanted deck as the stern rose into the night sky. It is the most famous maritime disaster in human history. For over a century, we've blamed the ice. We've blamed the captain's arrogance, the severe lack of lifeboats, and the reckless speed of the vessel through a known ice field. And honestly, if you read the official inquiry transcripts from 1912, that is exactly the narrative you are supposed to believe. But the truth is, disasters of this magnitude rarely start with a massive cinematic collision. They start quietly. They start with a mundane, everyday mistake, a misread memo, a rushed handover, or in this case, a guy packing his bags in a hurry, completely unaware that he was sealing the fate of over 1,500 people. Pause. To understand what actually happened out there in the dark, we have to go back, not to the freezing ocean, but to a damp, foggy morning in Southampton, England. April 1912. Meet David Blair. David is 37 years old. He's a career mariner, a guy who has spent his entire adult life working his way up the ranks of the White Star Line. And right now, he is having the absolute best week of his life. He has just been appointed as the second officer on the newest, largest, most luxurious ocean liner ever constructed by human hands. For weeks, David has been living and breathing this ship. He's been overseeing the final preparations, making sure the navigation equipment is calibrated, double-checking the inventory. It's tedious, unglamorous work. You can imagine him sitting in his cramped cabin, drinking stale, lukewarm coffee, checking off cargo manifests under the dim, buzzing glow of an incandescent bulb. One of David's specific responsibilities is the ship's optical equipment, the binoculars. Out on the open ocean, especially at night, binoculars are the only early warning system a ship has. There's no radar, there's no sonar, just two guys freezing in a crow's nest, staring out into the blackness, relying on magnified glass. Because the ship is still in port, and there are hundreds of contractors, dock workers, and crew members swarming the decks, things have a habit of walking off. So, David does what any responsible officer would do. He takes the ship's high-powered binoculars, locks them securely in a wooden cabinet in the crow's nest, and slips the small 3-inch brass key into the pocket of his heavy wool uniform coat. It's a totally normal thing to do. Think about how many times you've slipped your house keys or your car keys into your pocket without even registering the movement. It's pure muscle memory. And at that point, it made perfect sense. The binoculars were safe. David had the key. The grandest ship in the world was set to sail in just a few days. But then, the corporate machines stepped in. It's April 9th, less than 24 hours before the maiden voyage. The executives at the White Star Line make a sudden, 11th-hour decision. They are nervous about the sheer, unprecedented size of this new vessel, so they decide to bring in a more senior officer from a sister ship to act as chief officer. Because of this sudden corporate shuffle, everyone in the senior staff gets bumped down a rank, and David Blair, he's the odd man out. He is abruptly removed from the crew roster. Imagine the crushing disappointment. You've spent weeks preparing this magnificent vessel. You've bragged to your family, your friends, and less than a day before you're supposed to make history, your boss taps you on the shoulder and says, "Sorry, David, pack your things. You're not going." David is devastated. And honestly, he's probably pretty angry. He goes to his cabin, he starts throwing his belongings into his canvas duffel bag, he's rushing. He just wants to get off the ship, get away from the awkward, pitying stares of his colleagues, and go home. He strips off his working coat, packs his gear, and hastily briefs his replacement, an officer named Charles Lightoller. It's a messy, rushed handover. A 15-minute tense conversation over a cluttered desk littered with shipping charts and half-empty teacups. David grabs his bags, walks down the gangway, and steps back onto the cobblestone docks of Southampton. He watches the massive black hull of the ship towering over him, probably feeling a bitter mix of relief and profound loss. What David Blair doesn't realize as he walks away, what he won't realize until days later, when the horrifying news hits the telegraph wires, is that he forgot to hand something over to his replacement. Sitting at the bottom of his coat pocket, entirely forgotten in the emotional chaos of his sudden firing, is a tiny 3-inch brass key, the only key to the binocular locker. The 10th of April, 1912. The grandest ship in human history pulls away from the docks of Southampton. The crowds are cheering, the brass bands are playing, and deep in the bowels of the ship, the massive engines hum to life. For the first few days, everything is perfect. The voyage is a triumph of modern engineering. But as the ship pushes further into the North Atlantic, the atmosphere begins to shift. Fast forward to the evening of April 14th. Imagine being Frederick Fleet or Reginald Lee, the two lookouts assigned to the night watch. You've just climbed a 50-foot steel ladder in the freezing dark to reach the crow's nest, a tiny exposed metal basket swaying high above the deck. The wind is biting, cutting right through your heavy wool coat. Your job is simple but critical. Stare out into the pitch-black ocean and look for danger. Naturally, the first thing Fleet does is reach for the wooden locker where the binoculars are supposed to be kept. He jiggles the handle. It's locked tight. He calls down to the bridge. He asks the officers for the glasses. But down on the bridge, Charles Lightoller, the officer who hastily replaced David Blair, is coming up empty. He searches the drawers, sifts through the cluttered desks, but he can't find the key. He probably assumed the binoculars were packed away in the cargo hold, or maybe misplaced during the messy, rushed handover in Southampton. And honestly, at that moment, nobody panicked. They just brushed it off. This is where the false sense of security really takes hold. If you look at the standard operating procedures of 1912, the officer's reaction makes total logical sense. The prevailing belief was that lookouts should rely entirely on their naked eyes to spot an object. Binoculars, they argued, narrowed your field of vision too much. They were only supposed to be used to times confirm times what you had already seen. Besides, they were standing on 46,000 tons of unsinkable steel. And the weather? It was absolutely perfect. There was no moon that night, but the sky was remarkably clear, completely packed with stars. The ocean was dead calm, flat as a piece of glass. The crew figured that if there was a massive block of ice in their path, it would be impossible to miss. They would see the stars blocked out by its massive silhouette. They would see the white foam of waves crashing against its base. They didn't need binoculars, they had perfect conditions. But that comforting, logical explanation was about to shatter. Because the truth was, those perfect conditions were actually a death trap. The fact that the ocean was completely flat wasn't a blessing. It was a fatal curse. Without wind or swells, there were no waves to crash against the edges of the icebergs. There was no white foam to catch the starlight. It was just dark ice sitting motionless in dark water. And it gets worse. The ship was sailing into a region where the freezing Labrador Current collided with the warmer Gulf Stream. This extreme temperature drop created a phenomenon known as a thermal inversion, a cold water mirage. The freezing air literally bent the starlight, creating a false horizon that crept up into the sky, camouflaging everything behind it. Up in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee are staring out into a pitch-black abyss, their eyes watering from the freezing wind. They are trying to pierce through a visual distortion they don't even know exists. If they had those high-powered binoculars, they could have cut through the mirage. They could have magnified the faint, starlit outline of the threat miles ahead. They would have had minutes to react instead of seconds. But they don't. Because hundreds of miles away, back in England, a disappointed man named David Blair is sitting in his home, completely unaware that the 3-inch brass key resting in his coat pocket has just doomed them all. And right now, the ship is barreling forward at 22 knots, about 25 miles per hour, straight into an invisible, frozen minefield. At exactly 11:40 p.m., the mirage finally breaks. Up in the freezing crow's nest, Lookout Frederick Fleet's eyes widen. Out of the pitch-black abyss, a massive dark shadow suddenly materializes in their path. It isn't white. It isn't gleaming. It's a black mountain of ancient ice, dead ahead, and it's less than a quarter of a mile away. Fleet lunges for the brass bell, striking it 3 sharp times the universal warning for danger ahead. He grabs the telephone, his hands shaking from the biting cold, and screams down to the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead!" First Officer William Murdoch immediately orders the wheel hard over and throws the engine telegraph into reverse. But physics is a cruel master. You cannot simply stop 46,000 tons of steel barreling forward at 25 miles per hour. It takes agonizing, breathless seconds for the massive rudder to even begin to turn the ship. They almost clear it. Almost. And here is where the reality of the disaster severely diverges from the movies. There was no massive cinematic crash. There was no explosive impact that threw people out of their beds. In fact, most passengers barely noticed it. Survivors later described it as a faint shudder, a dull, grinding noise like a giant finger dragging along the side of the hull. One passenger said, "It sounded like tearing a piece of calico cloth." Down in the boiler rooms, the stokers saw a sudden spray of freezing water, but up in the first-class cabins, people just rolled over and went back to sleep. And honestly, that is the most terrifying part of this whole story. The sheer, quiet normalcy of the moment they were doomed. Because below the waterline, the ice wasn't slicing the steel open like a can opener. The immense pressure was simply popping the iron rivets out of the hull plates. The seams buckled, and the freezing ocean began pouring into 5 separate watertight compartments. When the ship's chief designer, Thomas Andrews, was called to the bridge to assess the damage, he didn't need a long time to figure it out. The math was brutally simple. The ship was designed to stay afloat, with up to 4 compartments flooded. But 5? 5 meant the bow would be pulled down, and the water would simply spill over the bulkheads into the next compartment, and the next, and the next. It was a mathematical certainty. The unsinkable ship was going to the bottom of the ocean. And it is only now, as the distress rockets are fired into the indifferent, star-filled sky, that the full, crushing weight of history sets in. Because this isn't just an anonymous vessel. The ship, bleeding out in the freezing dark of the North Atlantic, is the RMS Titanic. Think about the sheer emotional horror of the next 2 hours. The realization creeping through the grand staircases and the third-class steerage, the 2 8-degree water so cold it felt like 1,000 knives piercing the skin, slowly rising deck by deck. The horrifying realization that there were over 2,200 souls on board and only enough lifeboats for half of them. And then, think about David Blair. Days later, Blair is sitting in his quiet, safe home in England. He probably has a cup of morning tea or stale coffee on the table. He unfolds the morning newspaper, and his heart stops. The bold black ink screams the unimaginable. Titanic sinks. 1,500 dead. He reads the horrifying accounts. The lack of warning. The lookouts who couldn't see the iceberg until it was too late. He reaches into his coat pocket. His fingers brush against cold, heavy brass. The 3-inch key. Did David Blair sink the Titanic? No. The thermal mirage, the speed, the flat ocean, the brittle iron rivets, it was a catastrophic cascade of failures. But human minds don't process tragedy like a math equation. We look for the what if. What if Blair had remembered to hand over the key? What if Fleet and Lee had those binoculars? What if they had seen the black ice just 10 seconds earlier? 10 seconds is all it would have taken to turn the rudder just a few more feet. 10 seconds to save 1,500 lives. Blair kept that key for the rest of his life, a heavy, silent ghost in his pocket. Today, 2.5 miles down at the bottom of the North Atlantic, the Titanic rests in total, crushing darkness. Deep inside the decaying wreckage, buried in a collapsed officer's cabin, there is a small wooden locker. Inside that locker, perfectly preserved in the freezing depths, sits a pair of high-powered binoculars. They have been waiting there for over a century, waiting for a little brass key that never came. Blood in the concrete, the hit that wasn't. Cold open hook. It was raining. Not a dramatic thunderstorm, just that miserable, freezing November drizzle that coats everything in a thin layer of ice and makes the streetlights look hazy. The person sitting in the idling lease sedan didn't seem to mind. They had been parked in the shadows of the gravel lot for almost 2 hours, staring at a single lit window in a corrugated steel office building. Around 8:15 p.m., the office light clicked off. A man walked out. You could hear his keys jingling in the quiet night as he pulled his heavy jacket collar up against the wind, head down, making a beeline for his pickup truck. The person in the sedan stepped out. They didn't run. They didn't rush. They walked calmly up behind the man, raised a 9mm pistol, and fired 2 shots directly into the back of his head. The sound was muffled by the rain. The man dropped instantly onto the wet gravel. The shooter stood there for a second, looking down. Then they simply turned, walked back to their car, put it in drive, and rolled away into the dark. And honestly, the whole thing was so clean, so surgical, and so completely devoid of any messy emotion that when detectives finally arrived and taped off the lot, they took one look at the body and immediately came to a very specific conclusion. They thought, this is a professional hit. This is the mafia. But they were wrong. The truth of what happened that night was a lot closer to home, far more amateurish, and incredibly tragic. Normal world setup. To understand how completely the police misread the situation, you have to understand the victim. His name was Arthur Penhaligon, though everybody just called him Artie. Artie didn't run an underground gambling ring. He didn't owe money to the mob. He ran Penhaligon Commercial Paving. He was 56 years old, and his life was, frankly, exhausting. He was the kind of guy who woke up every single morning at 4 a.m. without an alarm clock. His routine was always the same. 2 cups of cheap, stale drip coffee out of a scratch thermos, sitting in the dark kitchen for 20 minutes, just trying to gather the energy to face the day. He was a guy with dirt permanently wedged under his fingernails and a bad lower back. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Brenda, for over 30 years. They lived in a normal, slightly cluttered suburban house with a golden retriever and a stack of junk mail on the kitchen counter that they always meant to sort through but never actually did. Artie wasn't a gangster. He was a small business owner stressed out about rising diesel costs, supply chain delays, and making sure his 12 employees got their paychecks on Friday. He was totally ordinary. And at the time, nobody in his life, not his wife, not his kids, not his friends, thought he was in any kind of danger. Why would they? Life was just life. First disturbance. But looking back, there were signs. Tiny, weird anomalies that didn't make sense until long after the yellow police tape was rolled up. Now at this point, you have to put yourself in Artie's shoes to understand why he didn't run. It was late October, about 3 weeks before the murder. Artie was working late in the dispatch trailer. It was a Tuesday evening, and the yard was mostly empty. Around 7 p.m., he heard the heavy crunch of tires on the gravel outside. He looked out the frosted, dirty window of his office and saw a dark blue sedan sitting at the very edge of the lot near the chain-link gate. The headlights were off, but the engine was running. He could see the thick white exhaust pluming in the cold air. Artie didn't panic. He actually just sat there in his desk chair, holding a stack of invoices, and watched it. People used his lot to turn around all the time. He watched the car for a minute, maybe a minute and a half. The car just sat there, idling in the dark. Someone inside was watching the trailer. Then, very slowly, it backed out onto the street and drove away. Artie actually mentioned it to his foreman, a guy named Dave, the very next morning. It was just a passing comment over coffee. "Hey, some weirdo was parked out by the gate last night." Dave asked if he got a plate number. Artie said no, which actually mattered later, because that plate could have blown the whole case wide open. But at the time, they both just laughed it off. They figured it was teenagers looking for a place to drink, or a lost delivery driver. You see, when you live a normal life, you don't immediately jump to the conclusion that someone is hunting you. You rationalize it. You downplay it. You just go back to worrying about the concrete pour scheduled for noon. But then, the silent phone calls started at the house. Just dead air when Brenda picked up the receiver. And slowly, a quiet, creeping feeling that something was very wrong began to bleed into Artie's ordinary world. And honestly, you can only ignore those silent phone calls for so long before it starts to wear on you. By early November, the air was getting colder, and that creeping dread was becoming a permanent fixture in Artie's life. He started doing little things, subtle things that showed he was spooked, even if he wouldn't admit it out loud. He'd wait in his truck with the doors locked until his employees showed up in the morning. He started double-checking the deadbolt at home, lingering by the front window, just staring out at the quiet suburban street, listening to the wind rattle the bare oak branches. Brenda noticed, of course. You don't sleep next to someone for 20 years and not feel when their heart is racing. But when she asked him what was wrong, Artie just blamed it on the stress of a new municipal parking garage contract. He downplayed it. It was that imperfect, human denial. He didn't want to scare her. And then came Thursday, November 14th, the day the normal world completely shattered. Artie usually walked through the front door at 6:15 p.m., right when the local news was starting. By 7:30, Brenda was pacing the kitchen. She tried his cell straight to voicemail. She called the office, ringing, dead air. At 8:15 p.m., she called Dave, the foreman. Dave lived about 10 minutes from the yard. He drove over in his sweatpants, annoyed but figuring Artie just fell asleep at his desk or his truck battery died. Dave pulled into the gravel lot. The heavy equipment was silent, casting long, monstrous shadows under the single, flickering sodium street lamp. The door to the dispatch trailer was slightly ajar. Dave walked up the wooden steps, pushing the door open, the hinges whining in the cold air. And what he saw in that cramped, fluorescent-lit office is something he would never be able to unsee. Artie was slumped over his metal desk, surrounded by scattered invoices and a massive, dark pool of blood soaking into the cheap carpet. He had been shot twice in the back of the head. It was brutal, efficient, and cold. When the police arrived, they taped off the lot, set up the blinding halogen work lights, and the rumor mill immediately started churning. Now at this point, you have to look at the environment. It's the Northeast. It's the concrete business. It's municipal contracts. The detectives walked into that trailer, saw an unrobbed cash box, untouched expensive equipment, and an execution-style double tap to the back of the head. It looked like a professional hit. A textbook mafia assassination. And honestly, it made total sense. The police dove headfirst into this theory. They spent weeks drinking stale coffee in idling unmarked cars outside known mob hangouts. They pulled all of Artie's business records, looking for the smoking gun. Did he owe a loan shark? Was he being extorted by union bosses? They found out Artie had recently underbid a rival concrete company for that big city parking garage project, a company whose owner had known ties to organized crime families in the area. It was the perfect narrative. It gave the chaos a shape, a logical, cinematic reason for existing. The local papers ran with it. The family was horrified, wondering if the man they loved had a secret, dark life. But the truth is, real life is rarely like the movies. And this perfectly logical explanation was about to completely collapse under the weight of sloppy, messy reality. The first crack in the mafia theory came from the financial forensic accountants. They went through every ledger, every W-2, every bank deposit, and found absolutely nothing. Artie was boringly clean. He paid his taxes, he didn't gamble, he had no hidden debts. Then, the physical evidence started contradicting the narrative. The ballistics report finally came back from the state lab. The murder weapon wasn't a professional hitman's suppressed 9mm or a clean .22 caliber pistol. The killer used a 1.6 gauge shotgun loaded with birdshot. It was a chaotic, sloppy weapon that caused a wide spray effect with little pellets. No professional assassin uses birdshot to make a clean hit. It's far too unpredictable. And then there was the footprint. Near the base of the desk, perfectly preserved in a puddle of spilled dried coffee, was a single partial shoe print. The detectives measured it. It was a size 8. Small. Narrow. far too small to belong to the hulking mob enforcers they had been tailing for 3 weeks. As Detective Miller sat in his cluttered cubicle staring at that photo of the size 8 footprint, the sickening realization washed over him. This wasn't a professional hit ordered by a mafia boss. The whole organized crime angle was a massive, time-wasting red herring. They were looking for a ghost in a tailored suit, but the real killer was someone entirely different. Someone messy. Someone much, much closer to home. And honestly, when you have to pivot a murder investigation from an organized mob hit to someone inside the victim's inner circle, it is an ugly, deeply uncomfortable transition. The detectives didn't want to believe it. It's much easier to blame a faceless syndicate than to look at a grieving family and wonder which one of them pulled the trigger. At first, they quietly worked their way through the outer rings of Artie's life. They spent a week looking into a cousin who had a minor drug charge in the 90s. A dead end. Then they looked at a neighbor who had complained about the noise from Artie's work trucks. Another dead end. The whole time they were stuck on that 1.6-gauge shotgun and that size 8 shoe. Now, at this point, Detective Miller was exhausted. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and he drove out to Artie's house to update the widow, Elaine, on the case. He walked into the kitchen, and the house smelled like pine sol and stale coffee, that distinct, heavy scent of a home where someone has recently died and people are just desperately trying to keep busy. Elaine was sitting at the kitchen island, looking hollowed out, wearing a faded, oversized sweater. Sitting across from her was Artie's two-year-old son, Justin. Justin was a quiet kid, always a little small for his age, struggling to find his footing in the world. He was the one who had initially found the body, the one who had made that hysterical 911 call. Miller sat down at the table, wrapped his hands around a cheap ceramic mug of coffee Elaine had poured him, and just let the silence hang for a moment. He looked across the table at Justin. Justin was staring at the floor, bouncing his leg nervously. And that's when Miller's eyes fell on Justin's feet. He was wearing a pair of worn-out work boots. Small, narrow, size 8. Miller's stomach gave a slow, sickening lurch. But lots of guys wear size 8, right? He tried to brush it off, second-guessing himself. He looked away from Justin's feet and scanned the kitchen island. Right in the middle of the counter was a massive, chaotic stack of condolence cards. Hundreds of them. Neighbors, friends, rival concrete companies, all sending their sympathies. Elaine had been meticulously opening them and storing them in a sturdy green and yellow cardboard box to keep them organized. Now, if you've ever been in a grieving house, you know people use whatever they can find to store things. Tupperware, shoe boxes, whatever is handy. Early on in the investigation, Miller had seen that box and thought absolutely nothing of it. It was just a family trying to manage their grief. But today, with the ballistics report burned into his brain, Though actually looked at the faded, peeling label on the side of that green and yellow box. His breath hitched in his chest. It was a vintage Remington box. 1.6 gauge. Birdshot. The exact, highly specific ammunition used to execute Artie. The breathing room in that kitchen suddenly vanished. The air felt suffocatingly thick. Miller looked from the box of shotgun shells to Justin's size 8 boots, and the entire terrifying truth collapsed into place. This wasn't a professional hitman. It was a terrified, desperate kid. Police later reconstructed exactly what happened, and it was devastatingly sloppy. Justin had quietly racked up a massive underground sports gambling debt. Not to the mafia, just to local bookies. He was drowning. Artie had found out and threatened to cut him off entirely to let him face the consequences. And so, Justin panicked. On the night of the murder, Justin didn't walk into the office with the cold precision of a mob enforcer. He walked in trembling. He took his grandfather's old bird-hunting shotgun from the back of the garage. The air must have burned his lungs as he stood behind his father. He hesitated. His hands shook so badly, he almost dropped the weapon. When he finally pulled the trigger, the 1.6, Gage kicked back fiercely, bruising his shoulder. It wasn't a clean, surgical strike. It was a chaotic, messy blast of birdshot. Then, in a blind panic, Justin tried to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, but realized he hadn't taken the cash box. He tried to make it look like a hit, stepping in the spilled coffee by the desk, leaving that single damning footprint. The emotional aftermath of this realization fractured the family beyond repair. When Miller gently asked Elaine to step out of the kitchen, she already knew. You could see the horror wash over her face as she looked at her son. She didn't scream. She just let out this low, guttural sob and collapsed into a kitchen chair, watching the detectives handcuff the boy she had raised for murdering the man she had loved. It was an unbearable, quiet tragedy. There were no cinematic monologues, just a kid crying silently as he was led out the front door. But the final, most haunting detail, the thing that stayed with Detective Miller for the rest of his career, happened an hour later when evidence technicians were bagging up that Remington box. They had to empty out all the heartfelt condolence cards first. They removed letters from sobbing relatives, notes of sympathy from old friends, prayers for peace. And there, at the very bottom of the box, buried beneath a literal mountain of the town's grief and sympathy, was the original, crumpled paper receipt for the birdshot. Justin hadn't even thrown it away. He had just buried his guilt under the sympathy of strangers, hoping no one would ever look close enough to see the monster hiding in plain sight. The Valley of Headless Men. Imagine a place so massive and remote that if you dropped the entire country of Switzerland into it, you'd still have room left over. Now imagine that inside this vast, beautiful wilderness, there's a specific 200-mile stretch of river that the local indigenous people absolutely refuse to go near. They call it the Valley of Headless Men. And honestly, for a long time, people just thought that was a spooky campfire legend. Just folklore to keep tourists away. Until the bodies actually started showing up. But before we get into today's strange and mysterious story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, hit the like button so hard that it drops its phone into a storm drain, and then offer to help it look, only to push it in. So, let's go back to 1904. The Klondike Gold Rush had basically ended, but that gold fever, it hadn't left people's blood. We meet two brothers, Willie and Frank McCloud. These aren't larger-than-life explorers or cinematic action heroes. They are just regular, tough, slightly desperate guys living in the Canadian wilderness, trying to make enough money to not freeze or starve the next winter. And you know how it is when you're desperate, you start listening to rumors you'd normally ignore. They hear whispers about a creek in the Northwest Territories, deep within the Nahanni River Valley, supposedly glittering with thick, raw gold nuggets just sitting in the shallow gravel. The logistical reality of this trip was an absolute nightmare. We're talking weeks of dragging heavy wooden boats up, violently freezing rapids, navigating entirely blind through these massive jagged canyons they literally just called Canyon 1, 2, 3, and 4. It was composed of grueling, deeply uncomfortable days. Waking up in damp wool, drinking stale, bitter coffee boiled over wet wood, swatting away thick clouds of black flies. But they did it. In 1904, they made the arduous trip, spent a year out there in the absolute middle of nowhere, and somehow, miraculously, they actually came back to civilization with a small fortune in coarse gold. They had proven the myth was real. So, naturally, in 1905, they pack up to do it again. They load up their boats with mundane essentials, sacks of beans, flour, heavy rifles, cast iron pans, and they head back up the Nahanni River. At first, no one really worried when they didn't come back by winter. In those days, out in the deep bush, you could easily get snowed in and just have to hunker down and wait for the spring thaw. It was normal. Their family just assumed they were stuck but safe, second-guessing any lingering anxieties. At the time, this didn't seem strange. But then 1906 passed. Then 1907. 3 whole years go by. By 1908, the brothers' family is beside themselves with worry. Their other brother, Charlie McCloud, just can't take the agonizing not knowing anymore. He organizes a search party and hires a local guide. And honestly, The vibe on this trip was probably incredibly grim. Charlie wasn't looking for a rescue, he was looking for a gravesite. After weeks of fighting the exact same brutal rapids his brothers did, Charlie's crew finally enters the third canyon. The air here is notoriously dead. It's surrounded by these towering rock walls that block the wind, making the whole area eerily, uncomfortably silent. Suddenly, the guide points to the riverbank. Tucked away in a small clearing of spruce trees, they see it. A camp. As Charlie rows closer, he's probably feeling this heavy, sinking hesitation. You can imagine him gripping the oars, staring at the tree line, not wanting to actually get out of the boat. He eventually ties off the line and walks up the muddy bank. The camp hasn't been destroyed by a bear or swept away by a flood. It's just sitting there, frozen in time. Ropes are still tightly tied around the trees. 2 rusted rifles are propped up against a rotting log, completely untouched. There's a blackened coffee pot sitting over a cold 3-year-old ash pile. It's that jarring mundanity everything looks like Willie and Frank just stood up to grab some firewood and never walked back. But as Charlie steps further into the tall brush, his boot catches on something hard hidden in the overgrowth. He looks down, and the horrifying reality of what actually happened to his brothers begins to slowly unravel. Charlie looks down. Under a thick layer of damp moss and rotting leaves, he sees a decaying leather boot. He just stands there for a long time. The wind rustles the spruce branches overhead, and the faint, rushing sound of the river echoes in the background. You can imagine him swallowing hard, not wanting to pull back the rest of the overgrowth. But he has to. He gets to his knees and begins brushing away the dirt. Beneath the brush, he uncovers the skeletal remains of his 2 brothers, Willie and Frank. The discovery is jarring, but what makes Charlie's blood run cold is how they are positioned. One brother is still securely tucked inside his heavy wool sleeping bag. The other is sprawled out near a tree, seemingly reaching for nothing. Charlie, shaking, begins to gather their remains so he can take them home for a proper burial. And honestly, this is where the story shifts from a tragic wilderness death to something deeply sinister. As Charlie gently sweeps the dead leaves away from the top of their collars to retrieve their skulls, his hand hits empty dirt. He digs a little deeper. Nothing. He searches the entire perimeter of the campsite. He checks behind the rotting log. He checks near the cold ash pile. There are no skulls, not a jawbone, not a single tooth. Both of his brothers' heads are completely, inexplicably gone. Charlie and the guide don't stick around to investigate. They pack whatever bones they can, jump back in the boat, and row out of the third canyon as fast as the current will take them. When they finally make it back to civilization, the news spreads like wildfire, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP, are forced to open an official investigation. Now, at this point, the Mounties are sitting in a warm, cramped office in Fort Simpson, sipping stale coffee and listening to Charlie's frantic report. They do what any overworked authority figure does when faced with an impossible situation. They rationalize it. They officially rule the deaths as exposure and starvation, followed by animal scavenging. The police report practically writes itself. It was wolves, they said. Or bears. Scavengers take heads and scatter bones all the time in the deep bush. It was a perfectly logical explanation, and for a while, people believed it. Families in the area nodded along because it was comforting to think this was just a grim reality of nature, not a murder mystery. They downplayed the danger. At the time, this didn't seem strange. But don't let that fool you. The local trappers and First Nations guides knew the Mounties' official report was absolute nonsense. A bear might drag off a body, sure, but a bear doesn't gently untie a sleeping bag, remove a human head, and leave the rest of the skeleton perfectly intact inside the bag. But without any more evidence, the case goes cold. The truth of what happened in that canyon was buried under bureaucratic paperwork. That is, until 1917, when the RCMP's neat little explanation completely collapsed. Enter Martin Jorgensen. Jorgensen was a tough, experienced Swiss prospector. He had heard the spooky legends about the Nahanni, he knew about the MacLeod brothers, and he didn't care. He was going in. Jorgensen spends months navigating the treacherous 4-5 degree turns of the river, pushing deep into the valley. And he actually strikes gold. He sends a message out to civilization that he's hit a massive vein and is building a small cabin to stay the winter. He's ecstatic. But then, a few months go by, and the messages stop. Complete radio silence. Eventually, a search party heads up the river to check on him. When they arrive at Jorgensen's claim, the first thing they smell is charred wood. His sturdy log cabin is completely gone, burned down to the foundations, just a blackened square in the dirt. But out front, lying in the tall grass, they find Martin's skeleton. His rifle is lying on the ground a few feet away, right next to a dropped matchbook. And as the search party steps closer, they realize the most horrifying detail. Martin Jorgensen's head is completely missing. The RCMP's animal scavenger theory shattered instantly. Animals don't burn down cabins. And they certainly don't take the head of an armed man right outside his front door. Something, or someone, was actively hunting people in the Valley of Headless Men. Now at this point, the RCMP couldn't just sweep this under the rug. The animal scavenger theory was dead. You don't get a burned-down cabin, a dropped rifle, and a perfectly missing head from a bear attack. The bureaucratic wall of denial had fully collapsed, and a chilling reality was starting to set in. They had to send an actual investigator. And honestly, let's be clear about what an investigation looked like out here in the 1920s. This wasn't a modern CSI unit. This was an exhausted, overworked Mountie and a local doctor sitting in a drafty wooden outpost, drinking stale, bitter coffee out of tin cups, staring at remains spread across a rough wooden table. When the doctor examined the cervical vertebrae, the bones of Martin Jorgensen's neck, he found something that made the Mountie's blood run cold. He didn't find the crushed, splintered bone you'd expect from the jaws of a wolf or a bear. He found deep, perfectly straight, clean striations on the bone. It was the unmistakable signature of a heavy, sharp steel blade, like an axe or a machete. And when they went back to the original dusty files of the McLeod brothers, looking at the crude autopsy sketches they had previously written off, they realized the exact same clean cuts had been documented, but ignored. This is the twist that turned the Nahanni from a dangerous river into an absolute nightmare. The true horror of the Valley of Headless Men wasn't a curse, and it wasn't an animal. It was the terrifying realization that there was a very real, very human killer, or a coordinated group of them, living deep inside the 10,000 square miles of this impenetrable wilderness. And they were actively hunting people. They were watching the river, waiting. And honestly, you have to imagine the sheer, isolating terror of this realization. For the local trappers and First Nations guides, the emotional aftermath was heavy and suffocating. People stopped going to the trading posts alone. They started looking at the tree line differently. Men who had spent 30 years surviving in the freezing deep bush, men who could fight off a grizzly without a second thought, suddenly refused to go anywhere near the Nahanni. It's a very specific kind of psychological trauma when you realize the vast, empty wilderness isn't actually empty. Someone is out there, moving quietly through the canyons, taking heads as trophies. At the local Mountie station, the mood shifted to quiet dread. You'd see officers sitting in their cruisers or at their desks, surrounded by junk mail and tedious administrative paperwork, staring blankly at the map of the Nahanni on the wall. They knew they couldn't catch whoever was out there. If they sent a patrol into the 4-5 degree bends of the river, they were just serving up their own men on a silver platter. So, they effectively did nothing. They quietly marked the valley as a dead zone. But the story doesn't quite end there. Because over the next few decades, the valley would occasionally claim someone else who thought the stories were just spooky campfire legends. Which leads to one final, deeply unsettling discovery. In 1945, a miner from Ontario named John Savard went missing in the same canyon. When the search party finally located his camp, everything looked completely ordinary at first. His tent was pitched perfectly. There was a pot of long frozen coffee sitting over the cold fire pit. But inside the tent, lying in his sleeping bag, they found Savard. Like the others, his head was completely severed and missing. But it was the micro-clues at the scene that made the search party pack up and literally run to their boats. Savard's sleeping bag was zipped up tight, right to where his neck used to be. But his right hand was resting outside the thick fabric, frozen stiff in the bitter cold. Gripped tightly in his hand was his heavy revolver. It was fully loaded, with the hammer pulled back and his frozen finger still resting heavily on the trigger. Savard hadn't been ambushed in his sleep. He had been lying there in the pitch black of his tent, wide awake, weapon drawn, listening to something walking around outside his camp. He knew they were coming. And despite being armed and ready, whoever or whatever was out there still managed to get inside, take his head, and vanish back into the endless, silent trees.